On a rainy evening in 1960, a young woman named Irene walked into her church to give confession, and she was never seen again. The last people to see Irene were the parishioners in the church that night. They saw her kneeling to pray, they saw her standing in the confession line, and they also saw her putting on a beautiful white lace veil. Then all sightings of her suddenly stopped, but no one saw her leave the church. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. And the next morning, when her family discovered her car still parked near the church, they immediately knew something horrible had happened, and they reported her missing. But no one could have guessed where this investigation would lead them. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Summer Sanchez, and today we're talking about the disappearance of Irene Garza and a massive cover-up by the Catholic Church. But before we get into the case, let's briefly talk about today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by Trade. It is officially cold brew season, especially where I live because it's already way too warm here. We've already seen temperatures in the 90s. And one fact about me, I really hate hot weather. It's my least favorite time of the year, but I absolutely love cold brew coffee, and I drink cold brew a lot to cool down in the summer months, and Trade has made it so easy for me to make my own cold brew at home. Trade has partnered with 15 expert roasters from all over the country to bring you the best quality coffee specifically designed for making cold brew. They also have all of the essential equipment for making your own cold brew at home. This is the Hario cold brewer. I use this all the time, and I like to prep my cold brew in the evening before bed so it's ready for me by morning. It's very easy to use. You just add the coffee to the filter, you slowly add in water, secure the lid, and pop it in the fridge. That's literally all you do, and you wake up to fresh cold brew coffee. And for a limited time, Trade is giving away a free Hario cold brewer when you sign up for a cold brew subscription. Just go to drinktrade.com/summer to get your free cold brew maker with select cold brew subscriptions. That's drinktrade.com/summer or scan the QR code on the screen. A big thank you to Trade for their continued support on this channel, and now let's get into the case. It was the evening of Saturday, April 16th, 1960, and 25-year-old Irene Garza made her way to Sacred Heart Catholic Church in McAllen, Texas. Irene had grown up in this area of Texas. McAllen is situated in the Rio Grande Valley, only about 5 to 10 miles from the border of Mexico. And Irene seemed to have a pretty great upbringing. There's nothing really to report about her childhood. She got along with her parents and siblings. She had a lot of cousins that she was very close to. And Irene was, by all accounts, a really great person. She was very kind, she was sweet, and she had a lot of friends. She was very well liked by her peers. She was the very first Mexican American to be selected for the twirling team at McAllen High School, and she also became the first Mexican American drum majorette at her high school as well. Irene was just one of those kids who was constantly making her family proud. She was just an all-around good kid. And after high school, she attended Pan American College. She was actually the first person in her family to attend college, so this was like a really big point of pride for her family, and she did really well. And as she grew up, she became known around town for her beauty. Her friends and family have said that she was constantly being noticed by the guys in town. She was crowned prom queen and homecoming queen, and in 1958 she actually won a beauty pageant and she was crowned Miss All South Texas Sweetheart. But Irene never let any of this go to her head. She was very humble. She was a very down-to-earth person. She got a degree in education and she landed a job as an elementary school teacher. She taught second grade, and Irene absolutely adored this job. She loved working with kids, and she truly cared about her students. There were several economically disadvantaged children at Irene's school. Some of these kids would even show up to school without shoes, and she would spend a lot of her own money on supplies and clothing for the children. And Irene's life was pretty great at this point. She had her dream job. She had this really great supportive family. She was still single, and she was dating around and, just having fun. And another aspect of Irene's life that she loved was her faith. She was a devout Catholic, and her church was super important to her. She attended Mass every Sunday, and she also went to confession every Saturday. And it was that Saturday evening in April of 1960 that Irene went to Sacred Heart Catholic Church for confession. Irene put on a nice skirt and top and some high heels. Then she asked her parents to borrow their car, and they said yes. And at around 6:30 that evening, Irene said goodbye to her parents. She told them that she wouldn't be long, and then she pulled out of the driveway and she headed to church. And this would tragically be the last time that Irene's family ever saw her alive, because Irene was about to come face to face with an absolutely vile human being, a person who has been called the epitome of a wolf in sheep's clothing. So Irene drives the couple of miles to the church. She parks the car a block or so away, and then she gets out and walks the rest of the way, and she goes inside the church. And no one ever sees Irene exit the church that night. Like, she goes in, but no one ever saw her come out, and she never returns home. Now, Irene is currently living with her parents, and so by 11 o'clock that night, they realized that she hadn't returned home yet. She had left the house at 6:30, and she said that she wouldn't be long, but here it is several hours later and still no Irene. They knew their daughter. She is a very responsible person. She wouldn't just, take the family car and stay out all night without telling them. Plus, this is all actually happening on Easter weekend. The next day was Easter Day. Some of Irene's family and friends were staying with them for the holidays, and they all knew that Irene would never miss out on spending time with them and having Easter celebration and Mass on Sunday. And when the next morning came and she still wasn't back, the entire family loaded up in their cars and they headed out to look for her. They started with the first place they knew Irene had been, which was Sacred Heart Catholic Church. And as they're approaching the church, they spot the car. It's still parked near the church, which is not a good sign. Why would her car still be there hours after she had already left? At this point, the family is thinking the worst has happened, and so they decided to go ahead and get the police involved. So they report Irene missing, and the police immediately launch an investigation. And the first thing they do is go down to the church to ask around, and see if anyone had any information. Did anyone see Irene that night? Had she even made it inside of the church? I mean, her car is there, but that doesn't really necessarily mean that she made it inside. What if someone snatched her as she was walking in? But several parishioners who had been at confession the night before confirmed that Irene had in fact made it inside the church. Confession had been pretty packed that night. Lots of people were there to, confess their sins the night before Easter. And by the time that Irene had arrived, there was a long line to get into the confessional. And so she had to wait for a while. Some of the parishioners told police that they saw Irene kneeling and praying. She was also seen at one point making the sign of the cross. She was seen placing a white veil over her head. And then by 8 o'clock that night, all sightings of Irene stopped. No one sees her past that point. So with no real leads, the police just decided to launch a massive search of the area. Tons of volunteers came out to help. They even had people on horseback searching open fields and dirt roads. Irene's family was getting the word out about her disappearance. There were newspaper articles and news segments about this case circulating everywhere. And then 2 days into the search, they found their first clue. A shoe was discovered on the side of the road, and Irene's family confirmed that this was her shoe. So the searchers continued looking in that same area where they had found the shoe, and the next day they discovered Irene's purse with her ID still inside. So things aren't really looking good. This is not a good sign, finding her shoe and her purse just discarded on the side of the road. And Irene's family was really dreading this news that they really felt like was coming. But then they finally got a small glimmer of hope when they received a phone call from someone who was claiming to be Irene. This woman said that she had been kidnapped and she'd been taken to a nearby town, and she was currently being held captive in a hotel room. And that was it. The call ended. And Irene's family, for the first time since her disappearance, were hopeful that she was actually going to be found alive. Police managed to track down the hotel room in the city of Hidalgo, but unfortunately, it had all been a prank. Someone had seen the news about Irene being missing, and they decided that it would be hilarious to give Irene's grieving family a little bit of hope that their daughter might still be alive. This seems to happen a lot in missing person cases, and it's just unbelievably cruel. And then 5 days after Irene's disappearance, the Garzas got the call that they were dreading. Irene's body had been discovered. She was found covered in mud and floating in an irrigation canal. Irene still had on the skirt and top that she had been wearing the day that she went missing. The buttons were open on the top and her underwear were missing. An autopsy confirmed that Irene had been beaten and she was sexually assaulted, and they believed that she was assaulted while she was unconscious, but her ultimate cause of death was asphyxiation without strangulation. She had been deprived of oxygen, but there was no sign that someone had manually strangled her. They also determined that Irene had been dead when her body was thrown into the canal because there was no water in her lungs, and they estimated that she had been in the canal for at least 4 days. There was no physical evidence found. There were no fingerprints, no semen, nothing. But police did find a muddy shoe print and a tire track near the bank of the canal, and they figured that this might be where the killer had pulled over to dump her body. Unfortunately, the prints were too muddy for them to really make anything specific out, like the brand or size of the shoe or the brand of tire. And with no other leads, it was decided that the canal would be drained just to see if anything important had sunk to the bottom. And they did actually discover something odd sitting at the bottom of the canal. They found a light green Kodak Kodaslide viewer. It's one of those old things that projects pictures, and this slide viewer had a long cord attached to it. Police didn't really know if this slide viewer was connected to the murder or not, but they decided to go ahead and reach out to the public just to see if anyone would come forward and claim it. And they actually received a response. A 27-year-old man named John Fight, or as the locals knew him, Father Fight, came forward and claimed the slide viewer. John Fight was a new priest in town, and he was currently on assignment at Sacred Heart Catholic Church. Could have been a coincidence, but police wanted to ask Father Fight some questions. And they found out that not only had Father Fight been there at the church the night that Irene disappeared, but he was also the priest who took her confession. Father Fight immediately gave police a suspicious feeling. In the beginning, he told officers that he didn't take Irene's confession, and then he changed his story and said that he did. And so many of the officers were suspicious of him from day one. Eventually, he did finally settle on his version of events, and he claimed that as he was leaving the rectory to head over to the church to hear confessions, his phone rang and it was Irene Garza. He claimed that Irene told him that she didn't want to give confession in the confessional because she was worried that other people would hear her. And so Father Fight says, no problem, just come over into the rectory and I will hear your confession here and you'll have all the privacy that you need. According to Father Fight, Irene went into the rectory, he took her confession, and then she walked out and went back towards the main part of the church. He then returned to the church to hear other confessions. Now, this information didn't really match up with what the police had heard from other witnesses. When they re-interviewed some of the parishioners, they mentioned that things were a little odd that night at the church. Confessions were taking much longer than normal because Father Fight kept leaving the church for short periods of time throughout the night. And the head priest, Father O'Brien, mentioned something very, very interesting. In between confessions, Father Fight had asked Father O'Brien to use the church car to go over to the pastoral house where he was currently staying in the city of San Juan, which was about 5 miles away. Father Fight told him that he needed to run to the house to grab an extra pair of glasses because he had broken his during confession. Now, this was not normal. Father Fight never asked to leave in the middle of hearing confessions. So Father O'Brien thought that this was strange, but he agreed to let him use the car. And when Father Fight returned back to the church that night, he had scratches on the backs of his hands and up his arms. You can even see the scratches here in this police photo. And Father O'Brien, when he noticed the scratches, he asked Father Fight what had happened to his hands. And he said, oh, well, I didn't have a key to get into the house. And so I climbed up to the balcony and I scratched myself up. If he was climbing like he claimed, and that's how he got scratched up, the scratches should have been on the opposite side. They should have been here on the palms and the forearm here. And Father O'Brien also mentioned that Father Fight hadn't just taken one trip to the pastoral house that night. In the 24 hours after Irene went missing, he had taken at least 6 trips to the pastoral house in San Juan, making up random excuses each time. And once the police heard this, they were even more suspicious of Father Fight. At this point, he was their prime suspect. But they kind of kept this quiet. They weren't really open about their suspicions of Father Fight. It was kind of taboo to talk about because no one wanted to believe that a priest would do something so horrific. And so it was something that started being said in hushed tones, it was something that was said in whispers between friends. And as the rumors started to spread that Father Fight might actually be involved in this murder, priests from other churches started talking to their congregations about the situation. And they would tell them not to, quote, bear false witness to any member of the clergy. They would also say, it's impossible that a priest would commit a crime like this. Don't speak of it. Don't even let yourselves think of it. So even if the people of McAllen did believe Father Fight was responsible, they were keeping those feelings to themselves. But police, on the other hand, they were in the thick of this investigation, and they knew that Father Fight had to be involved somehow. However, one thing that Father Fight did have going in his favor was that he had an alibi. First of all, he had continued listening to confessions that night after Irene was last seen, and he also gave midnight mass that night, and he also gave mass the next morning. There were some gaps in his movements that evening, like the fact that he kept leaving the church between confessions, and that random trip to the pastoral house to get glasses and then returning with scratches. It was all super suspicious, but they couldn't work out how Father Fight would have been able to abduct Irene, assault and kill her and dump her body, all while still fulfilling his duties at the church. So for the time being, Father Fight does remain their prime suspect, but they carry on interviewing other people. They interviewed hundreds of people, including ex-boyfriends of Irene's, family members, neighbors, acquaintances, friends, all known sex offenders in the area. They conducted more than 60 polygraph tests as well, and still no one stood out as much as Father Fight. And this feeling that Father Fight was involved got even stronger when just a couple of weeks after Irene's murder, he was linked to another violent attack. A 20-year-old woman named Maria America Guerra had been attacked just 3 weeks before Irene disappeared. The day of the attack, Maria was at church, the Sacred Heart Catholic Church in Edinburgh, not the Sacred Heart Church in McAllen where Irene had attended. This was another branch of the church in the nearby town of Edinburgh. So Maria arrived at this church and she walked inside and she headed over to the altar to pray. And as she was walking up to the altar, she notices that there's a young man sitting in one of the pews and he appears to be praying. Now, this was taking place outside of service hours. Lots of Catholic churches will leave their doors open for people to come in and pray throughout the day. And that must have been the case here because at this point, it's just Maria and this man inside the church. And when Maria spotted this man sitting in the church, she started to feel a little bit unsettled because she thought she recognized this man. She was pretty sure that she had seen him earlier that day watching her from his car. This blue and white sedan had been lurking around and she saw this guy staring at her and she was pretty sure this was the same person. But with this being a church, a place where Maria felt the safest and she felt like this was a sacred place, she told herself that nothing bad could happen to her here. And so she just tried to shrug off this eerie feeling and, do what she came to do, which was pray. So she makes her way over to the altar, she kneels down and she started to pray. And as she's praying, Maria is suddenly grabbed from behind. The man who had been sitting in the church had crept up behind her. He grabbed her and attempted to shove a piece of cloth into her mouth. But Maria fought back with everything she had and she bit down on the man's finger really hard, so hard that she actually drew blood. And in response to this, the man shoved Maria back towards the wall, and this gave her the chance she needed to get away, and she managed to escape. And she bolted out of the church as fast as she could, and she just starts screaming for help. Maria immediately reports this attack to the police, and she gives them a description of this man. She says that he has dark hair, he wears horn-rimmed glasses, and then she says something pretty shocking. Maria said that she got the impression that this man might be a priest. She couldn't say for sure, but based on the type of pants that he was wearing, she just got the impression that he might be a priest. So word of this attack starts to spread, and suddenly there are whispers around town about who this person could be. Could there really be a priest attacking women in a church of all places? It seemed too horrible for people to even consider. This is a very religious community. However, it seems that some of the priests in town knew exactly who had done this, and Maria's intuition had been right. Whether Father Fight confessed to the other priests or they just figured it out, I don't know, but somehow they knew. And instead of turning him into the police, the priest decided to just ship Father Fight off to another church, 12 miles away, to the Sacred Hearts Church in McAllen, the same church where Irene would go missing just a few weeks later. So while investigators are working on the Irene Garza case, police in Edinburgh were still actively working on the Maria America Guerra case, and they decided to bring Maria in to take a look at a photo lineup, because at this point they're starting to wonder if maybe these two cases are related. In the lineup, they had some photos of some of the men that they had questioned in Irene's case, including Father Fight. And as soon as Maria sees the photo of Father Fight, she says, "That's him. That is the guy who attacked me." And a witness who had seen the man fleeing from the church that evening also came forward, and she also immediately identified Father Fight. So now this priest has been implicated in not one but two very serious crimes against women. So police in Edinburgh bring Father Fight in to question him about the attack on Maria. Of course, he denies everything, but there was a lot of circumstantial evidence against him. First of all, he admitted that he had been driving around in a blue and white car that day, the same car that Maria saw following her. He also admitted that he had been in the Sacred Hearts Church in Edinburgh that evening, the same evening that Maria was attacked. But he claimed that he had made it back home to the pastoral house in time to ring the 5:30 bell. This would have put him arriving home at least an hour before Maria was attacked. She was attacked at around 6:30. However, this story was not backed up by some of the other priests. According to them, Father Fight, in fact, had not made it back in time to ring the 5:30 bell, and when he came home that evening, he had a cut on his finger, and police thought that that cut could have been from Maria biting him. Father Fight's explanation for the cut on his finger was that he had gotten it caught in some machinery the day before the attack. but the other priest said they were sure that that cut had not been there until the day of the attack. And this is the part of the story where I just get super confused, because it seems like some of the priests were at least kind of being forthcoming about things. They're kind of contradicting Father Fight's explanation for some of these things, like the cut and ringing the bell. But then you'll see, as we get further into this case, that they cover up a lot of stuff. So it's like there's no consistency there. Sometimes they're contradicting him, and sometimes they're involved in massive cover-ups. I don't get it. But whatever the case, with all of the circumstantial evidence and the 2 eyewitness accounts, Father Fight was charged with the assault with intent to rape of Maria Guerra. The case went to trial in 1961, but unfortunately it ended in a mistrial. The jury had deadlocked 9-3 in favor of conviction, and to avoid another trial, Father Fight ended up pleading no contest to the lesser charge of aggravated assault. And guess what his sentence was? Just guess. A $500 fine. That was it. No jail time. And he was allowed to continue being a priest. And now, knowing that Father Fight has a history of violence towards women, he's even willing to attack women inside of a church, you would think that police would have wasted no time at all pursuing him in the Irene Garza investigation. They were already suspicious of him, and now knowing that he had attacked another woman also in a church, you would think that it would be a no-brainer to aggressively investigate this person in Irene's murder. But that's not what happened. The higher-up members of the clergy did everything they could to cover up Father Fight's involvement in Irene's case. And this cover-up goes very deep. It wasn't just the church. The local authorities were in on it as well. It turns out that church officials had managed to make a deal with prosecutors. They told them that they would punish Father Fight themselves within the confines of the church, and they would even ship him off somewhere far away if the prosecutors would allow him to plead no contest in Maria's case, and if they would stop pursuing him in the Irene Garza murder case. So that is how Father Fight got off the hook so easily. The church and the county officials were working together. And over the next few months, police backed off of their investigation into Father Fight. They led the family to believe that the case was still very much active and they were looking for the person responsible. But in reality, everyone knew who had done it. In fact, high-ranking members of the church paid Irene's parents a visit. And during this visit, they told her parents that if it was discovered that Father Fight was in fact responsible for Irene's murder, the church would make him suffer way more than any law enforcement could. The message seemed to be like, just back off the case. Don't worry about it because we know who did it and we're going to make them pay, which is a really weird thing to tell a couple of grieving parents who were desperately wanting justice for their daughter. And as the months passed, it became very clear that the case had gone cold. No one was really talking about it anymore. The news stopped reporting on it, and it would be decades before Irene's killer was finally brought to justice. Father Fight's downfall began in 2002, 42 years after Irene was murdered, and it all started with a phone call from a monk. Actually, he was a former monk, and his name was Del Tashney, and Del had called detectives in San Antonio, Texas in 2002 and told them an unbelievable story. He said that he had been a monk at the Assumption Abbey, a Trappist monastery in Ava, Missouri back in the 1960s, and part of his position at the monastery required him to counsel troubled members of the clergy. Del said that in 1963, Father John Fight was sent to his monastery, and the abbot came to Del and said, "Look, this guy's been sent here because he murdered a woman back in Texas. We want you to talk to him and counsel him and, see if he would be a good fit for our monastery." And that's exactly what Del did. Those were his orders. So over the next several months, Del started to counsel Father Fight, and eventually he started opening up. And what Del heard was extremely disturbing. He had been harboring this secret for the last 40 years. Del had since left the monastery, and he had gotten married and had kids, and he was now in his 70s. And before he died, he decided that he needed to get this information to the authorities and unburden himself. So Del proceeds to tell this detective in San Antonio everything he could remember about those counseling sessions. Father Fight confessed that he had killed a woman back in Texas. Father Fight didn't tell him this woman's name, but he said that he had killed her on Easter weekend after having a private confession in the rectory. Father Fight told him that he listened to this woman's confession and then he attacked her. He started groping her, then he hit her with an object and sexually assaulted her. He then bound and gagged her and moved her down to the rectory basement. He said later he moved her from the basement to a second location, and at some point Father Fight forced this woman to get into a bathtub and he covered her with a large plastic bag. As Father Fight was leaving the second location, he could hear the woman say, "I can't breathe." He then left that second location and headed back to the church for a while, and by the time he returned, the woman was dead. She had suffocated in the plastic bag while he was gone. Father Fight said he loaded the woman's body into the church car and then dumped her into a canal. Now, it just so happened that right around the time that Dell came forward with this information, the Texas Rangers had started a cold case unit, and they had just reopened the Irene Garza case. Ranger Rudy Jaramillo was taking the lead for the Rangers, and Police Chief Victor Rodriguez was the lead back in McAllen, and they started working together on the case. They had gone back and meticulously combed through the evidence. They were looking for any trace of hairs or semen or anything left behind on, the clothing, the purse, or the shoes, but that had led nowhere. So they were not off to the best start on this cold case, but then they hear about this call from this former monk, Del Tashney, and they're listening to a story and they're thinking, everything this guy is saying fits with what we already know. And it answered a lot of questions, like how Father Fight was able to continue hearing confessions and give midnight mass the night of the disappearance. Well, now they knew that Irene was bound and gagged in the basement of the rectory, allowing Father Fight to move back and forth between the church and the rectory, which are right next to each other. And remember, some of the parishioners who were there, they said that he kept disappearing for long stretches of time between confessions. So that means that this monster was running back and forth between the church and the basement of the rectory, where he was holding a bound and gagged woman captive and assaulting her. He would run over to the rectory to check on Irene, and then he would run back over to the church to hear more confessions. And that second location that Dell mentioned, that was the pastoral house in San Juan, 5 miles from the church. Remember, Father Fight had broken his glasses during confession, and he had taken the church car to that house, and he came back to the church that night with scratches on his hands. So what actually happened is Father Fight loaded Irene into the church car and moved her to the pastoral house, where he likely assaulted her again. Then he put her into the bathtub, covered her with that plastic bag, and left her there, even after he heard her saying that she couldn't breathe. Then he headed back to the church just in time to give midnight mass. And when he arrived back to the pastoral house, he discovered Irene had died in the bathtub. And remember that slide viewer that was found at the bottom of the canal? Well, Father Fight was never able to explain how that got down into the canal in the first place, but now police had a theory. That slide viewer had a long cord attached, and it's believed that that cord was used to bind Irene's hands, and Father Fight just tossed it into the canal when he dumped her body. Also, remember how they said they had questioned like 500 people and conducted more than 60 polygraph tests? Well, it turns out that Father Fight had been given multiple polygraphs and he had failed every single one of them. We know lie detector tests aren't really reliable, so that alone doesn't really say much. However, investigators managed to track down the person who had conducted the tests. And they said that out of all the people they had tested in the Irene Garza case, Father Fight was the one person that they were extremely suspicious of. His entire demeanor was just off. He was trying to throw off the test by breathing erratically. He was also saying strange things to the tester, like, they'll never find enough evidence on me, so they'll never be able to convict me. Things that an innocent person does not say. So with all this new information, investigators finally felt like this was their big break. After 40 long years, Father Fight would finally be held accountable. But what had Father Fight even been up to all of these years? Was he even still alive? The answer to the latter question is yes, he was still very much alive. He was now 69 years old and he had left the monastery years ago. He was living in Phoenix, Arizona. He was married. He had 3 kids. He was also a grandfather. But what about before he left the church? The Catholic priest who visited Irene's family had promised that if they ever found out that Father Fight had murdered their daughter, he was going to be severely punished. Well, we know that church officials knew that Father Fight had killed Irene, but he was not punished like they said he would be. He was sent to that Trappist monastery in Ava, Missouri, where he was counseled by Del Tashney. And after serving as a monk there for a bit, it was decided that he was not a good fit and he was shipped off to another location. This time, he was sent to New Mexico to the Order of the Servants of the Paraclete. This is a treatment center, and it's a place that's been described as essentially a home for troubled priests, which that sounds ominous in itself.
For decades, priests from across the country came to New Mexico for treatment of alcohol abuse and psychosexual issues. They went to the Servants of the Paraclete for so-called rehabilitation. Many of those priests ended up in parishes here in New Mexico. The Attorney General says in some cases that sexual abuse continued.
We're talking about the worst of the worst, okay? These were really bad priests that were sent to this place. For example, a priest named Father James Porter was sent to this treatment center for sexually abusing dozens of children. Father Porter had started abusing children at the age of 18 while he was in training to become a priest. And once he was officially a member of the clergy, the abuse got so much worse and way more frequent. In 1960, he was assigned to the St. Mary's Grammar School in Attleboro, Massachusetts, where he was put in charge of the altar boys. And you could just imagine how that went. Now, this church knew that Father Porter was molesting the children at the church. Multiple parents had reported him to church officials, but instead of turning him into police or, at the bare minimum, stripping him of his title and defrocking him, they just moved him to different churches where he could assault more children. And this is a problem in religion in general. This is not specific to the Catholic Church. There are countless cases of church officials protecting known predators. So, knowing that Father Porter was a predator, he was sent off to another church where he continued abusing more children. Father Porter molested at least 60 children in the North Attleboro area alone. And then in 1964, one of his victims reported him to the police, and he was sent to a psychiatric hospital for a year. That was it. Just a year, and then he was released and allowed to re-enter the church and continue being a priest and continue working with children. And he just picked right back up where he left off. Of course he did. And the Catholic Church knew that this was still happening. They knew that tons of children were being hurt by this priest. And again, instead of doing the right thing and turning him into authorities, they sent him off to that home for troubled priests where he met Father Fight. Now, by this time, Father Fight had been at the home for troubled priests for a few years, and he eventually had worked his way up the ranks. So now he had like an official position at this place. After 6 years, he was promoted to superior. A known murderer and rapist has been promoted to superior at a home for troubled clergymen. And this title came with power. Father Fight had the power to decide where priests in the home were reassigned. Because of course they don't stay there forever. These monsters are just set loose back into these churches to prey upon innocent children. And it was actually Father Fight who had approved weekend furloughs for Father Porter, who at this point had molested at least 100 children by his own admission. And it was also Father Fight who reassigned Father Porter to a new church, knowing that he was 100% going to hurt more children. Father Porter just continued this pattern of abuse for the next several years until he finally wrote a letter to the Pope and asked to be released from the priesthood. In the letter, he admitted that he had abused countless children and he felt like it was time for him to leave the church. And in 1974, the Pope granted him this release from the priesthood, and that was that. James Porter went out into society, he got a job, he got married, he had 4 children, and as you can imagine, he was still a horrible human being. He was a terrible father and husband, and of course, he just continued abusing children in the community. It never stopped. His own son later came out and said that his dad had sexually abused him when he was a child. James Porter's case might be the worst case of pedophilia involving the church that I've ever heard. This case actually deserves an entire video of its own, to be honest, and I might actually cover this one day. But by 1990, some of Father Porter's victims started coming forward with horrific allegations of abuse. These people were not kids anymore, and they were ready to share their story and get justice. And an arrest was finally made.
He used to come to our home a couple nights a week. He would bring my brother home from baseball or basketball, and he'd sit and drink coffee with my mom, and then he would play in our basement with all of us kids. And he pretty much had free reign because he was a priest.
He was moved by the bishop in Fall River because of the heat there to the servants of Paraclete to get treated and recycled, where he was allowed to work in parishes and abused there in New Mexico and then in Texas, and then continued to abuse and was sent to Minnesota, where he was sent to Our Lady of Snows in Nevis, Minnesota, in the Bemidji area, where Linda and her family and many other kids trusted this priest at St. Philip's School, and where he abused many kids, and that became known in the early 90s. The sad part about this is not that he was allowed to continue his predatory ways, but that the bishops and top officials made conscious choices to protect him and themselves.
And at the time that James Porter was arrested, he was actually a Sunday school teacher. He was initially charged with over 200 counts of sexual assault, but that was later reduced to 41 counts after he took a plea deal. He was given a sentence of 18 to 20 years with the possibility for parole. Thankfully, his parole was repeatedly denied and he was never allowed back out into society.
The 70-year-old Porter died Friday, nearly 12 years after he admitted to sexually assaulting as many as 100 children during the 60s and 70s in the Fall River Diocese.
And I think that the most important thing is that they don't have to worry about that anymore.
Phil Saviano is with Survivors Network of those abused by priests. He says Father Porter's case was one of the first to show how the church moved priests accused of molesting children from parish to parish.
I know that that was a little detour in the case, but Father Fight was involved in the James Porter case because he had aided Porter in finding new assignments where he would just continue abusing kids. And it speaks to the main theme of this video. There's a problem with high-ranking members of churches protecting the worst of the worst. And it's like, what was the Catholic Church thinking? They put a known murderer and rapist in charge of other sexual predators. So investigators asked Del Tashney if he would be willing to call Father Fight and see if he would make a confession. You know, it's probably a long shot. They haven't spoken in decades, but you never know. Maybe he would make a confession.
Hello.
Hello, John.
Yes.
This is Dale Tashney.
Dale. Long time no hear.
I've been, for about 40 years now, covering up and holding within me something that I've known about and could never talk about.
Are you referring to the Irene Garza murder in the Rio Grande Valley?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah, that has been in the newspapers recently.
Yeah, and there are relatives that are living, and I would really appreciate, or helpful to me at least, if you'd come with me to those relatives and...
Come with you to those relatives?
Yeah, and explain to them that, we've been responsible. You've been responsible on your end for the accident or unfortunate thing that happened. I covered up along with you all these years.
And I am telling you this evening that I am not the man who killed Irene Garza. And I certainly don't intend to instruct you, but I can only say that you're going to have to go with your conscience on this and do what your conscience tells you is right, because that's exactly what I'm doing.
Well, I guess I'm very confused then now. More so than I was before. Because you told me that you did, in fact, participate in the death of a young woman.
Well, I can only repeat myself and say I am not the man who killed Irene Garza. And it grieves me that it's causing you pain at this point in your life. I will pray for you.
What?
That this cloud and this cross might be lifted from your mind and heart.
So they didn't get a confession from John Fight like they were hoping, but another member of the clergy who was linked to the case did come forward. Father Joseph O'Brien, the head priest at Sacred Heart in McAllen back in the 60s, was suddenly willing to talk. Up to this point, Father O'Brien had always stuck to the party line of, we've looked into this, we've left no stone unturned, we've really looked into Father Fight and we found nothing. But when detectives interviewed him in 2002, he had a totally different story.
Did he put her anywhere to hide her, to place her in anywhere where he might have?
The bathtub.
Did he tell you how he killed her?
Well, she died from the gagging, asphyxiation.
Father O'Brien and the other priests had been suspicious of Father Fight literally from day one. So suspicious, in fact, that they had actually searched the rectory the day after Irene's disappearance looking for her. They even went down into the basement, but by that point she was already gone. Father O'Brien had questioned Father Fight in the months after the murder. According to Father O'Brien, Father Fight did finally tell him what he had done to Irene Garza that night in 1960. But Father O'Brien and the other priests in the order were desperate to cover this up. And unfortunately, the sheriff at the time also wanted to cover it up. A man named E.E. Vickers was the county sheriff at the time of Irene's murder, and he was also a devout Catholic. And he, like the priest, did not want the public to find out that a priest was responsible for this murder. And he did whatever he could to stifle the investigation. Officers were pulled off the case. Officers who were positive that Father Fite was their guy, they were pulled off the case in order to just let it go. And that was when Father Fite was shipped off to Ava, Missouri, to the Trappist monastery, where he met monk at the time, Del Tashney. So investigators are pretty excited because this is the first time that they had people willing to come forward and confirm what the community already knew. And these two people were affiliated with the church, so this was a big deal. And they're like, okay, we finally have enough to charge this guy. Like, we can finally prosecute. But that's when another shady character enters the story, District Attorney for Hidalgo County, Renee Guerra. Now that Irene's murder case was being talked about again because of the efforts of the local McAllen police and the efforts of the Texas Rangers with this cold case unit, people were starting to talk about Irene Garza's case. And so Renee Guerra, being the district attorney, he was asked if he had any plans to charge John Fite with Irene's murder, and this was his response to that question. I reviewed the file some years back. There was nothing there. Can it be solved? Well, I guess if you believe that pigs can fly, anything is possible. Then he said, why would anyone be haunted by her death? She died. Her killer got away. And that last part really hurt Irene's family, who were still trying to get some justice for her. They had been fighting for her for over 40 years. And you have this person in power, a person who you really need on your side to prosecute this case, literally tell you that it is never going to happen. He will never prosecute John Fite. And when the public started to push back and ask, why are you not going after this guy? Renee Guerra basically accused the Texas Rangers of coaching Del Tashney and Father O'Brien. He pushed this narrative that the investigators were feeding these people information and like coaching them on what to say. This ended up actually turning into a pretty public back and forth between Renee Guerra and the investigators. You know, times had changed. This was no longer the 60s. People were talking about this. There were no longer whispers about maybe a priest is involved. People are talking about it, and they want to see Father Fite be held accountable. Whether he was a member of the clergy or not, they didn't care. They just wanted justice for Irene. And District Attorney Renee Guerra was starting to get some pretty serious negative publicity for his unwillingness to prosecute. District attorneys are voted in. It's an elected position, and so Renee Guerra started to worry that he might lose his seat because he wasn't willing to prosecute. So, in an attempt to quiet things down, in 2004, Renee Guerra ordered 2 prosecutors to bring evidence against Father Fite to the grand jury. But this attempt, if you want to call it that, was a joke. They didn't call on Del Tashney or Father O'Brien, who were both more than willing to testify in front of the grand jury. In fact, the only person that they called to speak was a woman who had been a secretary at the church when Irene was killed. And this woman had also been called as a witness for the defense in Maria Guerra's case back in 1961. Why would the only person that the prosecutors call be someone who had defended Father Fite on the stand 40 years ago? Why would they pick her over the 2 men who had come forward with all of this information that the jury would need to hear to progress the case? This case was largely circumstantial, and they needed to hear that Father Fite had confessed to both of them. In my opinion, this was a deliberate self-sabotage because Renee Guerra wanted this case to disappear. He had to at least do the bare minimum to get the public off his back and appear like he was going after Father Fite. But in my opinion, and in lots of other people's opinion, he deliberately did a terrible job presenting the case to the grand jury.
But you don't believe Fite ever confessed to him?
I don't believe so.
Guerra was the DA in 2002 when Tashney came forward. He refused to charge Fite. We spoke to him in 2013.
I mean, why would he make up this conversation?
I don't know.
And guess what? It worked because the jury decided not to indict Father Fite. Renee Guerra is also a member of the Catholic Church, and many people believe that he was also protecting them. He completely denies this allegation, but I mean, it's a bad look. So now they're kind of stuck. You know, they have all of this new information. They wanted to take this to trial. And so investigators don't really know what to do at this point. So they decided that in an attempt to make the case files public record, Police Chief Rodriguez announced that he was going to close the case because in the state of Texas, once you close a case, all of the records are fair game and they're available for anyone to see. People would really be outraged once all of that information was out in circulation, and you could really see all the corruption that happened back in 1960 and was still happening today. But Rene Guerra put a stop to that. He did not want those records getting out to the public. So he actually threatened to prosecute Police Chief Rodriguez if he made those records public. Unfortunately, with the grand jury decision, the case stalled again for more than a decade. And then in 2014, Irene Garza's family got the news that they had been hoping for. Rene Guerra was no longer the DA in Hidalgo County. He lost his campaign for re-election to a man named Ricardo Rodriguez. And part of Ricardo's talking points on his campaign trail was his promise to prosecute the Irene Garza case. The case itself became a key political talking point because so many people in the area wanted to see Father Fight behind bars. Ricardo Rodriguez ended up with 70% of the vote, I believe it was, and he officially took office in 2015. And thankfully, he did actually follow through on his promise. Father Fight went to trial in November of 2017, and the man that the public saw when he walked into the court was this little old 80-something-year-old man using a walker to get around. And if you didn't know the horrific things that he had done, it would be very easy to feel sorry for him. Irene's parents had passed away years before this trial, but their extended family was there every single day. But no one showed up to support John Fight. His family was not there, which I think says a lot. Father O'Brien died before the case went to trial, but thankfully Del Tashney was still alive and he took the stand and gave his testimony.
He assaulted her, bound her, and gagged her. As he left, he could hear her saying, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe."
A woman named Beatrice Garcia was called to testify as well. She testified that back in 1960, she was walking to work and a man pulled up next to her.
I was walking to work. A car approached me and I said, "Can I help you, sir?" And he said, "I would love to take a picture of you dressed in black by the cemetery."
And that man in the car, who was it?
He was the priest. That's him right there.
Beatrice identified the driver as Father Fight, and thankfully, Beatrice did not get any closer to the car and she got away because it's believed that Father Fight had been planning to attack her that day as well, and he was planning to abduct her off the street. Luckily, he used probably the creepiest pickup line ever, and it didn't work. Another witness was a reporter from back in the 60s. His name was Daryl Davis, and he testified that he had an off-the-record meeting with the district attorney back in 1962. The DA, a man named Robert Lattimore, told him that he knew Father Fight had killed Irene and he was being sent away to a monastery as punishment.
He said, "We know," verbatim, "we know that Father Fight killed Irene Garza." And I remember he said, "And the church knows that he killed Irene Garza. So we have made some arrangements." He said, "The church is going to put him in a monastery for disturbed or troubled priests, and he will be kept there for the rest of his life."
And a woman named Anna Maria Hollingsworth, a friend of Irene's, testified that in the weeks leading up to her death, Irene had mentioned that Father Fight kept pulling her out of the church to have private confessions in the rectory, which Irene thought was strange, but she trusted him. He was her priest.
It's not the same, she says, going to confession anymore because I don't get to stay in the confessional.
He had pulled her out of the confessional, told her she was too good to confess in the confessional, and took her to the rectory.
So Father Fight's original claim that Irene had requested to give confession in a more private setting, that had been a lie. He had been pulling her from the church into the rectory to get her all alone. But one of the most damning pieces of evidence that the prosecution presented was a letter that they had found buried deep within the case files. This letter was written back in 1960 by a priest named Father Joseph Paulecki. And this letter essentially was a step-by-step guide on how the church was planning to work with the sheriff to protect Father Fight from being prosecuted in Irene's case. Last week, I had the opportunity of speaking with the sheriff about this case. His observations are not only keen and based upon much experience in such matters, but seem to be the course we should follow. I gave this same set of observations to Bishop Riker, and he too is impressed with the saneness and the practicality of the sheriff's conclusions. After outlining to the sheriff the many facts I have received from Father Nash, the sheriff is of the opinion that the case is quite weak for the prosecution. He is also of the opinion that the prosecution must be made to see just how weak their case is, lest they go off half-cocked and set the wheels into motion that would bring this out to public print and give the opponents of the church a field day. There are also political implications that this could make a juicy scandal for the opposition to Kennedy. So let's just pause here for a second just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So the sheriff that they're referring to would have been Hidalgo County Sheriff E.E. Vickers, the one who pulled everyone off of Irene's case back in the 60s and essentially shut the whole thing down. And that mention of Kennedy, well, Irene was murdered in 1960, which was an election year, and John F. Kennedy was running for president. And if he won, he was going to be the very first ever Catholic president. So the Catholic Church as a whole really wanted to see him win. And the priests involved in the cover-up were thinking that if it got out that a Catholic priest had murdered and sexually assaulted a woman, this could be a talking point for the opposition, which was Richard Nixon, and this would cost Kennedy the election. The letter continues. First, the sheriff said that we should follow the idea of not hiring a lawyer for the reasons given by Father Nash. Second, we should not put a detective on the case hired by us, since that would mean that he would be snooping around, requesting witnesses, and stirring things up again. However, he does feel that we should hire a person, something like a first-class private detective who would be able to sit down with Father Nash and Father Pastor of McAllen, which I'm assuming is Father O'Brien, to get all the information on the case. Then let him write it up and present it on paper in such a way as to highlight the loopholes that are so numerous in this case. Once this is done, arrange a meeting with the police chief of McAllen, the prosecuting attorney, and the sheriff, plus 4 priests. At this meeting, the whole situation is brought out, and the prosecution will be able to see how strong the opposition is to their charges. They can also be brought to realize in a nice way that the church will not take this sitting down. The sheriff does not want more than the number mentioned, and he thinks that this will quiet things down considerably. Once this is done, then after 3 or 4 months, or even less if possible, have this young man transferred to another part of the country as a normal obedience. He feels that everyone knows that priests are always being transferred around, so this would not be strange. After some time in this new place, a year or 2, then have him sent out to a foreign mission. The reason for the first move is to get him out of the area of suspicion. If something happens, the officers of the area will always be suspicious of him. The sheriff concludes that the longer time we have, the weaker the case gets, and so he suggested all of this foregoing. He has much experience in such things and believes that this is extremely wise. He is also a Catholic, and he also stands to lose materially by such a scandal here in such a non-Catholic area. I feel that he has rendered us an invaluable service. Now, the prosecution felt that this was undeniable proof that the church and the sheriff worked together to keep Father Fite from being prosecuted in Irene's case, and it definitely does look that way. But the defense argued that this was all being taken out of context and it proved nothing. It actually proved that the church was just talking about how weak the prosecution's case was, and they were just, kind of going back and forth with ideas on how to prove that Father Fite was innocent. Father Fite's defense was mostly just that there was a lack of physical evidence in the case. It was mostly just circumstantial.
There isn't any forensic evidence that affirmatively linked John Fite to this crime in any way. Is there any evidence of DNA? The evidence will show you no. You will see her purse. Is there any evidence of fingerprints? The evidence will show you no.
But the jury felt that, the case might be circumstantial, but it is a lot of circumstantial evidence, especially when you add in the fact that Father Fite had a history of attacking women in a church. And in the end, Father Fite was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Unfortunately, most of the people involved in the cover-up had died before they could be brought to justice. Some people think that Del Tashney should have been in trouble for not reporting all of this sooner, and I can definitely see why some people think that. He did hold this secret for decades, but I can also see it the other way, because if it hadn't have been for Del coming forward, John Fite would have probably never been brought to justice. Del did visit Irene's family back in 2002 after he initially came forward, and he apologized for not saying something sooner. He also visited Irene's grave and he paid his respects. John Fite was found unresponsive in his cell and he died on February 12th of 2020. He was 87 years old. And that is all I have on this case. Please let me know what you think about this one down in the comments. Don't forget you can go to drinktrade.com/summer or click the link in the description box to get your own Hario cold brewer with select cold brew subscriptions. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing, liking this video, and leaving me a comment. That is the easiest way for you to support me and my channel. And as always, I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I will see you next time.